Vincenzo Moretti was not a man who handled different well. In his world, a change to a family recipe was more than a mistake. It was seen as an act of war. The middle-aged boss sat at the head of the table, his salt and pepper hair slicked back and his jaw clenched in a rugged, angry expression. He expected his grandmother's century-old osso buco, exactly as it had always been served. But in the kitchen, Jordan Hayes had other plans. The young chef, with his neat buzz cut and focused eyes, looked at the traditional dish and saw something uninspired. He was tired of hiding his identity. Risking a bullet for a bold vision, Jordan did the unthinkable. He swapped the veal for slow-braised oxtail and infused the sauce with smoked paprika and fiery Scotch bonnet peppers. As he stirred the pot, he knew he wasn't just cooking dinner. He was signing his own death warrant. The moment of truth arrived. Jordan adjusted his white chef's jacket and carried the plate into the dining room. As he lifted the silver lid, a rich, smoky aroma from the south hit the nostrils of the most dangerous men in the city. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the sharp click of safety catches being flipped off on the guards' weapons. Jordan leaned forward, placing the plate down with firm resolve. Enzo stared at the food, his brow furrowing as he noticed the deep, vibrant colors that shouldn't be there. His fist, decorated with a mechanical gear tattoo, was clenched tightly on the table. Jordan stood his ground, meeting the boss's glare directly. He stood there, his heart hammering against his chest, waiting to see if Enzo's first bite would be the start of a revolution or Jordan's final meal. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant swung open, and the warm air of the kitchen was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp breeze. A group of men in dark suits stepped inside, but all eyes immediately landed on the man in the center. Vincenzo Enzo Moretti walked with a slow, heavy rhythm that seemed to make the floorboards hold their breath. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back perfectly, and his rugged, intense face looked like it was carved out of stone. He didn't need to raise his voice to get attention. His presence alone filled the room like a thick, heavy fog. Enzo moved toward his usual corner table, and the entire restaurant fell into a frightened silence. The clinking of silverware stopped. People lowered their voices to a whisper. To Enzo, this wasn't just a place to eat. It was a kingdom where he was the only king. He sat down and leaned forward, his black suit jacket tightening across his shoulders. He rested his hands on the white tablecloth, revealing the intricate circular tattoo on the back of his hand. The mechanical gears in the ink seemed to move as he clenched his fist. A large silver ring on his finger glinted under the chandelier lights, looking more like a weapon than a piece of jewelry. His jaw was set in a hard line, and his furrowed brow showed he was in a mood for total obedience. The waiters moved with trembling hands, careful not to make a single sound as they poured his dark red wine. They knew that one small mistake, a dropped spoon or a spilled drop of water, could lead to a disaster. Enzo didn't look at the menu. He didn't need to. He simply stared ahead with eyes that seemed to see right through people. He was there for one thing only, the taste of his family's history. The air in the room felt thin and tight, as if everyone was waiting for a storm to break. In that moment, the restaurant felt less like a dining room and more like a courtroom where Enzo Moretti was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Enzo beckoned the head waiter over with a single, slow flick of his finger. The man rushed to the table, his face pale and his notebook trembling in his hand. He didn't ask what the boss wanted. He simply waited, bowing his head in respect. Enzo didn't look up at first. He picked up his wine glass and took a slow sip, his eyes fixed on the empty white plate in front of him. The silence at the table felt heavier than a lead weight. Finally, Enzo spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "The Nana special," he said. The words were short, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. And tell the kitchen I want it exactly the way she made it. Not a grain of salt more. Not a leaf of basil less. He leaned forward, his clenched fist resting on the table next to his silver ring. The rugged lines on his face deepened as he glared at the waiter. I have traveled across the ocean and back, Enzo continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I have tasted the finest food in the world, but nothing compares to the recipe my grandmother left behind. It is my blood. It is my history. The waiter nodded quickly, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. Everyone in the restaurant knew the rules of the Nana special. It was a sacred dish. Over the years, stories had been told about chefs who tried to get creative with the recipe. Those chefs were never seen again. To Enzo, changing the dish wasn't just a kitchen error, it was a personal insult to his family name. If the sauce is too thin, or if the meat is not tender enough, Enzo warned, his eyes narrowing into cold slits, I will consider it a sign of disrespect. And you know how I feel about disrespect. He waved his hand, dismissing the waiter. The man turned and hurried toward the kitchen doors as fast as he could without running. Behind him, Enzo sat perfectly still, waiting for the one thing in the world he still valued. He wanted the taste of the past, and he was willing to destroy anyone who dared to change a single part of it. Inside the kitchen, the air was hot and thick with the smell of boiling water and old wood. Jordan Hayes stood at his station, staring down at the tray of veal that had just been delivered to his table. The meat was pale, bland, and gray. To any other chef, it was just an ingredient, but to Jordan, it looked like a cage. This was the Nana special he was expected to cook, a dish that was hundreds of years old and hadn't changed by a single inch. Jordan picked up a piece of the meat. It felt cold and lifeless in his hands. He knew exactly what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to lightly flour it, sauté it in butter, and add the same tired splash of white wine. He had done it 1,000 times before. Every night he followed the rules. Every night, he hid his own talent to make sure a man he didn't even like stayed happy. As he looked around at the shiny steel walls of the kitchen, he felt a soul-crushing boredom settle over him. He felt like a ghost in his own life. The head waiter burst through the double doors, sweating and gasping for air. Enzo is here, he hissed, leaning over the counter. He wants the special. And Jordan, he warned me. If it isn't exactly like his grandmother's, there's going to be blood. Don't get fancy. Just do the recipe. Jordan didn't answer right away. He looked at his own reflection in the side of a silver pot. He saw a young man with a sharp buzz cut and a neatly trimmed beard, a man who had spent years learning the secrets of spice, smoke, and soul from his own family. He thought about his grandfather's kitchen, where the air was filled with the dancing heat of peppers and the deep, rich scent of slow-cooked oxtail. Suddenly, the boredom snapped. It turned into a hot flame of defiance in his chest. He looked at the bland veal and then at the door leading to the dining room. He realized that if he cooked this dish the correct way one more time, he would lose his soul forever. He was tired of being a vessel for someone else's history. Jordan took a deep breath and pushed the tray of veal aside. His heart began to pound, not with fear, but with a strange kind of excitement. He reached into his personal bag and pulled out a small, glass jar of dark, red spices. Tonight he wasn't going to be a servant. Tonight he was going to be a chef. He decided right then and there that he was done hiding. Jordan moved with a new kind of energy, his movements quick and sure. He reached into the back of his private locker and pulled out a small, worn wooden box. Inside were glass jars filled with colors that didn't belong in a traditional Italian kitchen. There were deep oranges, smoky reds, and coarse black seeds. These were his heirloom spices, the private stash he had kept hidden for months. These flavors carried the memory of his own grandfather, a man who taught him that food should tell the story of where you come from, not just where you are. He set a heavy iron pan on the flame. Instead of the light butter the recipe called for, he began to sear the meat until it had a dark, caramelized crust. He opened a jar of smoked paprika, and the scent hit the air like a warm campfire. Then came the Scotch bonnet peppers. He chopped them with expert speed, releasing a heat that made his eyes sting in the best way possible. This was the technique his grandfather had mastered: slow heat mixed with bold, earthy heart. Jordan began to build the sauce. He ignored the light wine on the counter and instead used a rich, dark stock that he had been simmering in secret. He added the spices one by one, watching as the liquid turned into a deep, mahogany brown. It was thick, fragrant, and powerful. Every time he stirred the pot, he felt like he was reclaiming a piece of himself. He wasn't just making a sauce, he was pouring his own history into Enzo's bowl. As the steam rose from the pan, it carried a smell that was completely different from anything ever served in this restaurant. It was the smell of wood smoke, sun-drenched gardens, and generations of black families cooking with love and fire. Jordan knew that he was breaking every rule in the Mafia's book. He knew that Enzo expected a very specific, very boring taste. But as he tasted the sauce on the back of a wooden spoon, a small smile touched his lips. It was perfect. It was the first time in years that he felt proud of what he was serving. He was done being a ghost. Even if this was the last meal he ever cooked, at least it finally had a soul. The smell of the kitchen changed in an instant. It was no longer the soft scent of butter and herbs. Instead, the air was filled with a sharp, smoky heat that made the other cooks stop in their tracks. One by one, the sous chefs turned around, their faces turning pale as they realized where the scent was coming from. They gathered around Jordan's station, staring at the dark, bubbling sauce with eyes wide with terror. "Jordan, what are you doing?" the senior sous chef whispered, his voice shaking. He looked at the jars of spices and the Scotch bonnet peppers on the cutting board as if they were live grenades. "That isn't the Nana special. That's something else entirely. You have to stop right now." "I'm making it better," Jordan replied calmly, without looking up from his pan. The kitchen staff began to crowd around him, their movements frantic. "Better? Enzo doesn't want better," another cook hissed, clutching his own apron in panic. "He wants exactly what he asked for. If you send that out there, he's going to think we are laughing at him. He's going to think this is a hit." They knew the stories of what happened when the Moretti family felt disrespected. They didn't just fire people, they made sure people disappeared. The youngest cook in the kitchen looked like he was about to cry. "Please, Jordan," he begged, his voice cracking. "Think about us. If he sees this, he won't just come for you. He'll come for all of us. He'll say the whole kitchen has turned against him. We have families, man. Just throw it away and start over with the veal." Jordan felt the weight of their fear pressing in on him. He saw the sweat on their foreheads and the way they kept glancing at the door, expecting an armed guard to burst in at any second. For a moment, his hand hesitated over the stove. He didn't want to hurt his friends, but he also knew he couldn't go back to the cage. "Get back to your stations," Jordan said, his voice firm and steady. "I'm the head chef tonight. If Enzo is angry, I'll take the blame. But I am not serving that gray meat." The staff backed away, but they didn't go far. They stood in the shadows of the kitchen, whispering prayers and watching the clock. To them, the bubbling pot on Jordan's stove wasn't a masterpiece. It was a ticking bomb that was about to blow their lives apart. The kitchen doors creaked open, and a heavy silence followed. A tall, muscular man stepped inside, his shadow stretching across the tile floor like a dark stain. This was Rico, Enzo's most trusted enforcer. He didn't wear a chef's apron. He wore a sharp black suit that struggled to hide his broad shoulders. On the back of his hand, a prominent tattoo featured an intricate circular design with mechanical gears, identical to the one on the boss's hand. Rico didn't say a word. He walked slowly past the prep stations, his eyes scanning every knife, every pot, and every face. The sous chefs tucked their heads down, scrubbing counters that were already clean, their hearts racing in their chests. Rico's presence was a reminder that in this restaurant, the kitchen was just another part of the Mafia's territory. As Rico approached Jordan's station, the air became thick with the scent of the secret spices. Jordan felt a cold sweat prickle the back of his neck, but his hands remained steady. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a pile of bright red Scotch bonnet scraps sitting on his cutting board. If Rico saw those peppers, the secret would be out before the plate even reached the table. With a smooth, practiced motion, Jordan swept the pepper scraps into an empty metal bowl and slid a pile of chopped parsley over the spot. Just as he tucked the bowl under the counter, Rico stopped right beside him. The enforcer leaned in, his shadow falling over Jordan's bubbling pot. Rico sniffed the air, his brow furrowing as he caught a hint of something smoky and unfamiliar. "The boss is hungry," Rico said, his voice deep and raspy. He reached out a hand, his tattooed fingers hovering near the edge of Jordan's pan. "He's in a bad mood, chef. He says the air smells different tonight. He sent me to make sure everything is being done by the book." Jordan didn't look away. He met Rico's gaze with a serious, focused expression. "It's a special heat," Jordan said calmly, gesturing to the stove. "The flames are running hot tonight, but the recipe is under control." Rico stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. He looked down at the cutting board, seeing only the green parsley. Finally, he gave a slow, stiff nod. "Make sure it is," Rico warned. "The boss doesn't like surprises." He turned on his heel and walked back toward the dining room, his heavy boots thumping against the floor. Jordan waited until the doors fully closed before he finally let out his breath. The secret was still safe, but the clock was ticking. Jordan stood alone at the center of the kitchen, his focus narrowing down to the white ceramic plate in front of him. The rest of the staff had retreated to the corners of the room, watching from a distance as if he were handling a dangerous chemical. He ignored their stares. His hands, usually just tools for someone else's vision, moved with a grace and speed that felt like a dance. This was the moment where his two worlds would finally collide. He reached for the braised meat. Instead of the pale, falling apart veal Enzo expected, Jordan carefully placed the oxtail in the center of the dish. It was dark, rich, and glistening with a glaze that caught the light like polished mahogany. To someone watching from across the room, it might look like a standard Italian roast, but as Jordan tilted the pan, the deep, soulful aroma of his own heritage filled the air. It was a smell that didn't belong here, a mix of smoky wood, sweet onions, and the hidden kick of the peppers he had disguised. With a silver spoon, he drizzled the reduction around the meat. He moved with extreme precision, making sure not a single drop was out of place. He garnishing the dish with herbs that looked traditional to the eye, but beneath the greenery lay a layer of spices that had been passed down through his family for generations. He was building a masterpiece of deception. On the surface, it looked like a professional, high-end Italian meal. But to anyone who knew food, it smelled like a revolution. Jordan wiped the rim of the plate with a clean cloth, his expression serious and set. He knew that this plate was a message. It was a statement that he would no longer be a ghost in a white jacket. He was a man with his own history, his own flavor, and his own pride. He leaned over the dish one last time, checking every angle. It was beautiful, bold, and terrifying. "Is it ready?" the head waiter whispered, his voice cracking with fear. He didn't want to touch the plate. He looked at it as if it were a bomb about to go off. Jordan didn't hand it over. Instead, he picked up the plate himself. He felt the heat of the ceramic through his fingers, a warmth that felt like a spark of fire in his hands. He straightened his chef's jacket and looked toward the double doors. "I'll take it out myself," Jordan said firmly. He stepped forward, leaving the safety of the kitchen behind. Jordan stepped through the heavy kitchen doors and into the dining room. The air here was different. It was cold, still, and smelled of expensive cigars and old leather. Usually, the servers moved like shadows, but as Jordan walked forward, the entire room seemed to freeze. Every conversation died mid-sentence. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic click of Jordan's boots on the polished marble floor. He held the plate in one hand, his fingers steady despite the pounding of his heart. As he moved past the tables of underbosses and enforcers, the wrong aroma began to spread. It wasn't the light, herbal scent they were used to. It was something deep, smoky, and soulful. It was a smell that commanded attention. Heads turned, and eyes narrowed. Jordan could feel the weight of their stares pressing against him like a physical force. At the back of the room, the guards standing by the walls shifted their weight. He heard the sharp, metallic clack of safety catches being flipped off. The men in suits didn't move their bodies, but their hands moved toward their jackets. They were like predators sensing something unfamiliar in their territory. Jordan didn't look at them. He kept his eyes locked on the man at the far end of the room. Enzo Moretti sat like a king on a throne, his salt and pepper hair slicked back and his jaw set in a hard, angry line. He watched Jordan approach with a rugged, intense expression. As Jordan got closer, the smell of the Scotch bonnets and the rich oxtail reached the boss. Enzo's brow furrowed, and he leaned forward, his chest tightening against his black suit jacket. His large silver ring glinted as he gripped the edge of the table, his fist clenching until his knuckles turned white. The silence in the room was deafening. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a storm breaks. Jordan reached the table and stopped. He didn't look down, and he didn't show fear. He met Enzo's glare directly, his face serious and focused. He slowly lowered the plate, placing it on the white tablecloth directly in front of the most dangerous man in the city. The steam rose from the dish, carrying the bold scent of a different world. Jordan stood tall, his white chef's jacket a bright contrast to the dark shadows of the room, waiting for the first word to be spoken. Enzo Moretti did not move. For a long, terrifying moment, he simply stared at the plate as if it were a riddle he couldn't solve. The steam curled upward, dancing in front of his rugged face, but his eyes stayed fixed on the food. The boss leaned in closer, his brow furrowing into deep, angry lines. He was a man who knew every detail of his world, and he could see immediately that something was wrong. The Nana special was supposed to be a pale, delicate shade of gold. But this dish was different. The meat was a deep, dark mahogany, glistening with a rich glaze that looked like melted silk. The texture of the sauce was thicker and heavier than the light wine reduction his grandmother had always made. Enzo's gaze moved to the herbs. They were bright green, but they were dusted with tiny, dark specks of spice that shouldn't have been there. A heavy, oppressive silence hung over the table. The other men in the room watched Enzo's face, waiting for the explosion. The boss reached out a hand, his large silver ring clinking softly against the edge of the plate. He tilted his head, studying the way the sauce clung to the meat. He noticed the tiny flecks of red pepper hiding beneath the surface, a color that was never allowed in a traditional Moretti kitchen. Enzo's jaw tightened, and his breath became slow and deliberate. He could smell the smoke and the hidden heat of the Scotch bonnets now. It was a bold, powerful scent that filled his lungs and challenged his memory. His intense eyes finally snapped up from the plate to Jordan's face. He looked for a sign of fear or a trembling hand, but Jordan stood perfectly still, his expression serious and focused. To Enzo, this wasn't just a different color or a new texture. It was a change to the only thing he had left of his past. his rugged face twisted with a mix of confusion and rising anger. He looked back down at the plate, his fist clenching so hard on the table that the mechanical gear tattoo on his hands seemed to tighten. The room felt like it was shrinking, the air getting hotter with every second that Enzo spent staring at the unauthorized masterpiece. He was looking at a plate of food that looked like a challenge, and the entire room held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The silence in the room finally snapped. Enzo's hand came down like a hammer, his heavy fist slamming against the table with a force that made the wine glasses jump. The sharp clink of his silver ring hitting the wood echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. The guards along the walls flinched, and several guests instinctively pulled back, but Jordan stayed exactly where he was, his feet planted firmly on the floor. Enzo leaned even closer, his face turning a dark shade of red. His jaw was so tight it looked like it might crack. He pointed a trembling finger at the dark, steaming oxtail. "What is this?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a cold, terrifying rage. "I asked for my grandmother's recipe. I asked for the history of my bloodline. And you bring me this?" He looked up at Jordan, his eyes burning with an intense, rugged anger. "You think you are an artist?" Enzo growled, the mechanical gear tattoo on his hand tensing as he gripped the edge of the table again. "You think you can take a century of tradition and throw it in the trash just because you wanted to play with spices? This is my heritage. This is the only thing that connects me to the woman who raised me. And you have defiled it." The room was so quiet that Jordan could hear the soft sizzle of the fat on the plate. The underbosses at the nearby tables watched with cold expressions, waiting for the signal to drag the chef away. Enzo's fist remained clenched on the white cloth, a symbol of the violence that was only seconds away. "I gave you a simple order," Enzo continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that felt like a blade against Jordan's throat. "I told you that any change was an act of war. You didn't just cook a meal, chef. You spat on my family's name. Give me one reason, one single reason, why I shouldn't have you thrown out into the alley right now." Jordan looked down at the plate and then back into the eyes of the most dangerous man in the city. He didn't blink. He didn't apologize. He knew that this was the moment where he would either find his voice or lose everything. Jordan did not pull back. Instead, he did something that made every guard in the room reach for their holster. He leaned forward, resting his own hands on the edge of the table. He met Enzo's fierce glare with a serious and focused gaze. The distance between the young chef in his clean white jacket and the mafia boss in his dark suit was only a few inches. Jordan could see the heat of anger in Enzo's eyes, but he did not look away. "You asked for your grandmother's recipe," Jordan said, his voice calm and steady. "But a recipe is just words on a page. It's just measurements and instructions. Anyone can follow a list of ingredients, but that isn't what made your grandmother's food special." Enzo's jaw tightened, and he looked like he was about to explode, but Jordan kept speaking before the boss could interrupt. "Your grandmother didn't cook with a ruler. She cooked with her soul. She cooked because she loved her family and wanted to give them something real. That is what I put on that plate. I didn't change the dish to disrespect you. I changed it because the old way had become a habit. It had become cold." Jordan gestured to the steaming oxtail, the aroma of smoke and spice rising between them. "Respect isn't a recipe, Mr. Moretti. It's a feeling. It's the passion of someone standing over a stove for hours to make sure the flavor is perfect. I gave you my heritage because that is the only way I know how to honor yours. I didn't give you a copy of a ghost. I gave you something alive." The room remained frozen. The guards looked at Enzo, waiting for a nod or a wave of his hand to end the conversation. Jordan's heart was hammering against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of firm resolve. He had said his truth. He had stopped being a servant and started being a man. Enzo stared at him, his rugged face unmoving. The boss looked at the young chef's eyes, then back down at the dark, rich meat. For the first time that night, the anger in Enzo's expression seemed to turn into a deep, silent curiosity. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply sat there, weighing Jordan's words against the weight of a century of tradition. Enzo Moretti did not move for a long time. He sat like a statue, his eyes locked onto Jordan's. The air in the room felt heavy, like the moments right before a thunderstorm. Nobody dared to cough or even shift in their seat. The guards stood perfectly still, their hands resting near their jackets, waiting for a signal. The only sound was the soft, distant hum of the kitchen's ventilation. Slowly, Enzo reached for the silver fork. His movements were smooth and deliberate. He didn't look at his men or the other guests. His world had shrunk down to the plate in front of him. He used the edge of the fork to cut a piece of the oxtail. The meat was so tender that it fell apart instantly, releasing a new cloud of steam that smelled of wood smoke and deep, earthy spices. Enzo lifted the fork. The rich, dark sauce clung to the meat, glistening under the warm lights of the dining room. He paused for a second, the food just inches from his lips. Jordan felt his own heart drumming a frantic rhythm against his chest, but he kept his chin up and his shoulders square. He had put everything he was into that bite. Then, Enzo took the first bite. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. It was a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Enzo closed his eyes as he chewed, his rugged face becoming a mask of deep concentration. His jaw moved slowly, savoring the heat of the Scotch bonnets and the smoky sweetness of the paprika. Jordan watched the boss's brow. At first, it remained furrowed in that familiar, angry line. But as the flavors began to settle, something changed. The tension in Enzo's neck seemed to loosen. The hard, clenched muscles of his jaw softened just a fraction. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for his wine. He simply sat there, letting the complex layers of Jordan's heritage wash over him. For 60 seconds, time stood still. Jordan stood at the edge of the table, his life hanging on the judgment of a single man. The outcome of the entire night, and the future of Jordan's career, was being decided by the taste buds of a mafia king. The dining room was so quiet that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. 60 seconds. In any other place, a minute was nothing. But here, standing before Vincenzo Enzo Moretti, every second felt like a year. Enzo continued to chew with a slow, rhythmic motion, his eyes never leaving Jordan's. Those intense, dark eyes seemed to be searching for something deep inside the young chef, looking past the white jacket and into his very soul. Jordan stood perfectly still. He did not fidget. He did not wipe the sweat from his forehead. He simply met the boss's gaze with a steady, quiet strength. He could see the reflection of the candlelight in Enzo's pupils, but he couldn't see what the man was thinking. Was the heat of the Scotch bonnet too much for a man raised on mild herbs? Was the smokiness of the paprika an insult to the memory of his grandmother? The underbosses at the surrounding tables leaned forward, their faces tight with anticipation. They were waiting for a frown, a nod, or the single wave of a hand that would decide Jordan's fate. Enzo's rugged face remained a closed book. His furrowed brow didn't move, and his clenched jaw only shifted as he savored the complex layers of the sauce. He seemed to be weighing the taste of the oxtail against every meal he had ever eaten in his life. He was comparing the sacred order of his past to the bold revolution Jordan had placed on his plate. The silver ring on Enzo's finger caught the light as he finally lowered his fork, the metal clinking softly against the ceramic. The silence stretched on, becoming almost painful. The air was thick with the scent of the dish and the heavy weight of judgment. Jordan realized that in this minute of silence he had already won a small victory. He had made the most powerful man in the city stop and think. He had forced the Mafia king to truly taste something new. Now, all that was left was the verdict. As the final seconds of the minute ticked away, Enzo took a deep breath, and the room seemed to lean in even closer, desperate to hear the first word that would break the silence. Then the impossible happened. The hard, frozen lines on Enzo's face began to melt. His furrowed brow smoothed out, and the rugged anger that usually defined his expression simply vanished. He looked down at the dark, mahogany sauce on his plate, and for the first time, his eyes weren't filled with cold judgment. They were filled with a soft, distant memory. The entire room seemed to exhale at once, though the guards stayed alert. Enzo took a second breath, but this time it wasn't a huff of rage. It was a sigh of relief. He looked up at Jordan, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was no longer a dangerous rasp. It was quiet and honest. "I have spent 20 years eating that veal," Enzo said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "I thought I was being loyal to my grandmother. I thought that by keeping the recipe exactly the same, I was keeping her alive." He looked back at the plate and shook his head slowly. But over the years, the dish became a ghost. It was just a list of instructions. It had no heart left in it. He looked at Jordan with a new kind of intensity, not the intensity of a predator, but of a man who had finally been understood. "My grandmother didn't cook because she had to follow a book. She cooked because she was a fire. She was bold, she was brave, and she put her whole life into every pot she stirred." A small, sad smile touched the corner of his mouth. "This oxtail, this heat, it doesn't taste like her recipe. But it tastes exactly like her spirit. You didn't defile my heritage, chef. You found the part of it that we had lost." The underbosses looked at each other in total shock. They had expected blood, but instead, they were watching a confession. Jordan felt a massive weight lift off his shoulders. He realized that Enzo wasn't just a boss. He was a man who had been starving for something real. By being brave enough to show his own soul, Jordan had helped Enzo find his again. The Nana special wasn't a cage anymore. It was a bridge between two different worlds, built on the one thing they both understood, true passion. The silence that had gripped the room for so long finally broke, but not with a shout or the sound of a weapon. Instead, it was the sound of a chair sliding back against the marble floor. Enzo Moretti stood up slowly. The guards reached for their jackets, their eyes darting toward Jordan, waiting for the order to move. Jordan kept his head high, his heart still beating fast, ready for whatever was coming next. Enzo walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of the young chef. He was taller than he looked when sitting, and his presence was still intimidating. He reached out his hand, the one with the silver ring and the gear tattoo. For a split second, the kitchen staff watching through the door windows gasped, thinking the boss was going to strike. But Enzo didn't clench his fist. He opened his palm. "You took a risk tonight, Jordan," Enzo said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Most men are too afraid to tell me the truth. They give me what they think I want. But you gave me what I needed." Jordan reached out and took the boss's hand. The handshake was firm and strong. In that moment, the tension that had filled the restaurant for years seemed to vanish. The underbosses and guards slowly relaxed, realizing that the war was over. "From now on," Enzo announced, looking around the room, "the kitchen is yours. No more old recipes. No more rules from the past. I want to taste your heritage every time I sit at this table. If anyone has a problem with that, they have a problem with me." The menu was changed forever that night. Jordan was no longer just a silent worker hiding in the shadows of a mafia kitchen. He was the man who had looked a king in the eye and won. As he walked back toward the kitchen, he saw his fellow cooks cheering and clapping. He had entered the dining room as a chef who was tired of being a ghost, but he walked out as something much greater. He was a legend, the man who used the power of soul and spice to change the world of the most dangerous men in the city. Jordan Hayes had found his voice, and the world was finally ready to listen.